at the first inauguration. I announced, and my staff didn't know I was going to say this. I mean, it's literally written in the margins of my inaugural speech that I was going to make Philadelphia the #1 green city in America.
Yeah.
And they heard it for the first time when I said it from the stage. They're like, what? You know, when you're the mayor and you've got 15 inches of snow on the ground, unlike some other jobs, you can't just go and give a speech. I mean, people okay, well, that was interesting, but you got 15 inches of snow and people need to get to work or go to school or whatever. So they expect you to do something.
Welcome to Straight Talk, a podcast about big ideas featuring candid discussions with some of the world's foremost thinkers and doers. I'm Hank Paulson, chairman of the Paulson Institute, and today I'm speaking with Michael Nutter. Mike is a former two-term mayor of Philadelphia who previously spent almost 15 years in the Philadelphia City Council. Under his leadership as mayor, Philadelphia's high school graduation and college degree attainment rates increased significantly. Homicides were brought to a 50-year low, and its credit ratings were upgraded to the A category for the first time since the 1970s. Mike served as the president of the United States Conference of Mayors, and since leaving public office in 2016, he has remained active in public policy, government, and civic life. He serves on the advisory board of the African American Mayors Association and is a founder of Cities United. He also serves as a David N. Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice in Urban and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Mike, welcome to the podcast. We've had the opportunity to work on a number of initiatives, and you really know how to get things done. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Hank, thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. Let's start with your early life. You were born and raised in Philadelphia. What was it like growing up Black in West Philadelphia?
Well, so this is, I was born in the late 50s. I think 57 might have been the height of the baby boom. So I think there are a lot of us from that time. And the neighborhood was, I've often described it as kind of middle class. We were the Nutters. We were the third Black family on our block. And I would say by the time I was about 10, there may have been 3 white families left. So a pretty significant change. The times today are somewhat reminiscent. There was different, but a fair amount of racial strife. I mean, this is still going into the 60s. I was 6 years old in first grade when President Kennedy was killed, and remember that day very specifically. Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Man on the Moon. At the same time, significant concerns about violence and also police brutality. In Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo had been the police commissioner and then the mayor, gang war activity, all of that. And I was, going through grade school and into high school. So it was an interesting time, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm a few years older. I was in high school, so I still remember what it was like when it came over the PA system that the President Kennedy was shot. And then, oh my gosh, the others, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And I lived in a suburb of Chicago, so I was insulated to an extent. But, the police brutality, it's Chicago 7,
Yeah.
And Mayor Daley.
Sure.
So what was your family like? Did you get inspiration there to pursue your career in local government?
No, not really. I mean, politics was not the family business. My father had been in pharmaceutical sales from time to time. He was a plumber. My mom had the more stable job, if you will. She went to work right out of high school at the time, Bell Telephone, and worked at Bell Telephone, now, of course, Verizon, but worked there for 33 years. Raised my sister and I, and, it was the 4 of us and my grandmother. So my mother's mother lived with us. My mom is a twin, and they had a younger brother, but my mom was the last one out of the house. And so I guess it was last one out of the house takes grandma. So she lived with us. And I developed a very, very close relationship with her. Her room was right next to mine. She had the kind of the last room in the house, and we became very close over time. But it was the kind of neighborhood where all the parents, worked or were active or doing their thing. Most of them had not gone to college, and the goal was for all of us as kids, these 60s and 70s kids to go to college. That was the goal of our parents, and virtually everybody in my neighborhood ended up going to college.
And that makes a huge, huge difference.
Yeah.
And so then I'm trying to get at, because, I think everybody knows you as this highly successful mayor,
Well,
but you
you're
spent
kind.
a long time. It's kind,
Yeah.
but it's got the added virtue of being true, right? Because you were but you spent a long time in city government first.
Yeah.
So how did you decide to go from what in college, or what was it
Yeah. Well,
that you wanted to
it's
give
it's
back to the community?
it's kind of a funny story. So, even though politics was not the family business, I mean, I was paying attention. It was, we just talked about, it was the 60s, right? So I was 10 turning 11 when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed in 68. The Vietnam War was still going on when I was a teenager. So I was paying attention. You certainly recall the barrel with the balls and picking numbers and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, the war was starting to wind down, but I was paying attention. The 68 convention in Chicago and all this strife going on in America. I had a great American history teacher at my high school. I went to St. Joe's Prep, Jerry Taylor. And he really gave me a sense and helped inspire me just to pay attention to what was going on in American politics and in history and government. But my real story of public service, I mean, other than my parents instilling a sense of, responsibility in the community, and every Saturday people went out and, swept their steps and their sidewalk, and we had block meetings and parties and all that kind of stuff. But I went to Penn, and my best friend from high school, Robert Bynum, he and I, best friends still today, went to Penn together. He went to Wharton. I was a biomedical engineering major, admitted to the engineering school because I was pre-med. And freshman first semester chemistry, it became very clear that I was not going to be a doctor because I was on my way to failing that chemistry course. And so, I needed to change of direction. In any event, the following summer of 76, Robert's dad opened the first Black-owned discotheque in Philadelphia. And we went to work there. And it was there at 19 that I started meeting all these elected officials and candidates and people who wanted to be involved in politics. And that's where I really started to see what was happening. You, of course, recall the rise of Black elected officials and Black politics in the 70s, mid 70s to late 70s. And it was at this nightclub that I started really seeing what was going on the political scene in Philadelphia. One thing led to another. I started working with volunteering for a city council person in the early 80s. Chicago was on the verge of electing its first Black mayor, Harold Washington, in 1983. Philly and Chicago are on the same election cycle. Wilson Goode was running in that 83 race in Philly. And my guy was running for re-election for city council. So I was now getting involved in the political process in Philadelphia, 25 years old. And that's where the inspiration came from and the understanding about public service.
Interesting. I'm going to go on with public service, but you said something that resonated with me. It sounds like you went to a Catholic school, right?
Yeah, I was born and raised Catholic, Catholic grade school and a Jesuit high school.
Yeah, well, I remember, and maybe I've remembered this incorrectly, but when I was in the White House as a kid and we were looking at education, I think it was Philadelphia, where John Cardinal Kroll
Yes.
was. And
Mhm.
because I remember then looking at education and looking at the per capita cost had doubled, the overall cost had tripled in America, and the output hadn't increased. The quality hadn't increased. But in a few places, it made a big difference. And one was Philadelphia. And I remember spending time with Cardinal Kroll. And I remember them thinking, going to Richard Nixon, obviously it went nowhere, and saying, you know what, this property tax is a blight on urban America.
Mm.
And it's unfair in terms of what it does to education, because
Right.
wealthier neighborhoods are better, in the suburbs have
Yeah.
a better focus. We should
Bigger
do
tax
away
base.
with urban property tax. We should have a value added tax or something to fund
Mm.
fund schools
Wow.
and do something. And so any event, so it's fast.
Yeah. Well, the the other aspect of it was, if they brought nuns into the public school system, you would probably see a dramatic difference as
Absolutely.
as well.
Yes,
They
that's what I saw. Absolutely.
they have a way of inspiring you.
Yeah.
No,
It was
no, it
pretty good.
was definitely different.
So now, so I want to go and talk a little bit. You are regarded as, and rightfully so, as one of America's most distinguished and successful mayors. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But I want to know about sort of the path to becoming mayor.
Mm.
How did you
Yeah.
how did you decide to run, and what were
Yeah.
some of the challenges you faced along the way?
Sure. So, coming out of that initial start in 1983, working with City Councilman John Anderson, Wilson Good goes on to become mayor. Unfortunately, John Anderson, the councilman who was my mentor, died that same year in 1983, about a month before the election. So, but we had talked that summer of 83 about me running for city council in a district race 4 years later in 1987, which I did do. Unfortunately, I lost, but learned a lot, and then ran again in 91 and was successful. And then, I was a pretty active city council person. I mean, I had a district, but I was also very much into the legislative process. So, I did the smoking ban in Philadelphia, ethics reform, created an ethics board, campaign finance reform, just very active, very visible in that way. Unlike Chicago, we have a 2-term limit in Philadelphia. So we're coming up on 2007 at the time. I'm in my 4th term, in my late 40s, and my now predecessor, during his administration, there have been some challenges in terms of crime, in terms of some ethics related issues, not specifically with regard to the mayor, but some other people in the administration. And I was starting to feel like, what am I going to do? I make it stay in city council forever, which I loved, but I wanted to do more. Thought I had some ideas. And as they say, no one's ever scored a touchdown from the sidelines. And so if I was going to get engaged, kind of put yourself out there. So I took a poll in May of 2006, kind of much like Chicago, Philly, heavily Democratic city. If you win the Democratic primary, you should go on to win the general election. So about a year before the primary in May of 87, I took this poll, well-known, highly regarded, Garen Hart Yang, Democratic polling firm, comes back and says, in a 5-way race, all the names that they put in, I could not win.
Yeah.
And it's like a serious poll with serious money. And this is May of 06. In June of 06, I announced that I was resigning my seat in city council and going to run for mayor with a poll in hand that said that basically I couldn't win. It ended up being a 5-way race. 2 members of Congress, a powerful state legislator who had been chair of the House Appropriations Committee for 20 years, and first time in Philadelphia, a self-funder, a multimillionaire who put $10 million into his own campaign and raised another 2. And then unemployed me. Now, at that time, former city councilman. I think the path was, we had a plan. And the plan was to talk about issues and to campaign hard. I was fortunate to have serious support from my family. We were able to put a series of compelling ads on TV for about 8 weeks, and we started to see some movement in our own internal polling. I talked about public safety because it was an issue. I talked about public education because it was an issue. I talked about jobs and sustainability because they were issues, and integrity in government, transparency and openness. That message, I think, resonated with some folks. People were ready for reform. They were ready for change. They were tired of the crime. They were tired of corruption and scandals. I was fortunate to have a spectacular, one of the ads featured my daughter, who in 30 seconds told my story better than I could in an hour. And people started paying attention to us. And we won. I got 37% of the vote in a 5-way race, 40% of the black vote, 37% of the white vote. And, like I said, you win the Democratic primary, you should go on to win the general election, and I did.
Yeah, it's amazing, Mike, the number of people like you who are highly successful that have had some adversity along the way. And that's what you learn a lot, and the fact that you lost, your first election, you lost
Yeah.
city
Mm-hmm.
council.
Right.
And some people will get
Which
discouraged.
no one now remembers.
And no one remembers. And some people, but I think the real satisfaction people get is doing something that's hard and then succeeding. And
Yeah.
boy, did you succeed as mayor. But I want to have a conversation now about race.
Yeah.
You have a really unique vantage point about this issue that the country is still grappling with big time today, social justice and race.
Yeah.
What do you think is missing from today's national conversation? And how can we move forward as a country? Because boy, we really need to.
Well, I mean, thank you for what you said, Hank. I think part of what's missing from the national conversation, quite honestly, is a national conversation. As Americans, we just all have to become more comfortable because we're going to be uncomfortable, but we have to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable about talking about race. This is the one thing, other than your own personal income. I mean, no one actually wants to have a conversation about race. People are either afraid, they're nervous, they think they're going to say the wrong thing. Some people think, well, look, we elected a black president. I mean, like everything's okay, right? Some people use that as a badge. Well, wait a minute, I voted for Barack Obama twice. I can't be a racist. Like, what does that have to do with anything? So, and then I think just there are many, many Americans who just don't want to acknowledge the history. It's either like it never happened or they're not responsible. Of course, not personally, but in many instances, people are beneficiaries of the system of slavery and oppression and discrimination, much of which is still with us today. And so I think the first part of dealing with this is being willing to try to deal with it. I don't want I don't want somebody else's stuff. I want my own stuff. you know Black people want to be able to buy a house just like white people. Black people want to be able to get a job. You literally want to be able to go outside and not be shot or attacked. you know, Black people believe in public safety. We're not against the police and law enforcement per se. What people are against is police brutality and being abused. And so I'm hopeful. I mean, it's been a tough, almost 4 years with many of the things that have come out of the Trump administration and the rise of hate groups. You know, the FBI tells us all the time. Obviously, we had to pay attention to international threats, international terrorism. But we've got homegrown terrorists, white nationalist groups and others right here in the United States of America. We need to pay attention to them. So, but look, I'm an eternal optimist. I think that we can continue to kind of get ourselves together. I do believe in the more perfect union and just being willing to, raise these topics like you. And I don't know if the listeners know, you and Erskine Bowles and the Economic Strategy Group, you're willing to have these conversations. And I'm hopeful that other leaders, people that folks respect, will be willing to at least listen. This is an incredible country. I've had an incredible amount of opportunity. I still have much to give back, but we have to have these conversations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I believe in progress. And I do think one of the great things about the United States of America is when there's a problem, we usually shine a light on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often what we see is very messy and wrong, but then we work to make it better.
Right.
And that's the best of America, right?
And we have to be willing to put in the work. These are not simple
It's not
things.
going to happen without work.
No.
It's not going to happen by saying a few words. And which really gets me to my next topic here, which is I've heard you say it so much I can almost say the words myself and think that I invented them, because I've heard you say time and again, talk about the uniquely pragmatic problem-solving orientation of American mayors. They don't get wrapped up in ideological debates because they're busy solving real problems.
Right.
And if they don't solve them, they don't get elected. The problems that voters care about. So talk a bit about that and what you think our national politicians can learn from our mayors.
Right. One of the examples I use, climate change notwithstanding, I mean, I guess when we used to get a lot of snow, and I'm not wishing for it, but, cities like, Philly and Chicago and New York and a bunch of other places and down south, they might not get a lot of snow, but they get a lot of rain. I mean, climate change is affecting us in so many different ways, which is one of many reasons why, I so admire your work. But, when you're the mayor and you've got 15 inches of snow on the ground, unlike some other jobs, you can't just like go and give a speech. I mean, people like, okay, well, that was interesting, but you got 15 inches of snow and people need to get to work or go to school or whatever. So they expect you to do something. And so every day in the local government, we've got public safety, education, jobs, economic development. People like water to come out of the faucet, clean water, in the morning. They like the street lights to work. And so you're responsible for all that stuff. And so they don't want to hear about budget challenges or this one doesn't get along with that one, or I'm in a fight with my city council, or so-and-so didn't speak to me or take me out to dinner or what. Like this local citizen, they have no time for any of that. And so we could never get away with local government people. We could never get away with the kind of nonsense that often we see sometimes at the state or federal level. Now, that's not to say at the local level we don't have our own nonsense, because we do. But usually it's personal or political, but no big impact on the citizenry. So every day as a mayor, you get judged. You don't need to poll very much. The public will let you know, is it working? Is it not working? And let that be your guide.
So I'd like to now move to the Mike Nutter leadership principles or management style. And I'd like to use sustainability initiatives, climate change, sustainability, to talk about them, because you got some important things done, and talk about some of them and what you accomplished, how you did it, and what you learned.
Well, I learned from many, many different leaders. Until more recently, there was really no mayor school. Mike Bloomberg teamed up with Harvard and created the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. But when I was coming along, we just learned from each other. So after I won that Democratic primary in 2007, I went to two cities to meet the leaders. I went to Chicago and I met Mayor Daley for the first time. And I went to New York and I met Mike Bloomberg. And a huge part of the inspiration for our sustainability efforts in Philadelphia actually came from Chicago. I've been talking about sustainability, during the campaign and all that, but meeting with Rich Daley really set me on a path. He took me up to the roof, of course, of City Hall, where they have the garden up there, one of the first in the nation. He talked about the need for beauty, that when people come out of their homes, they should see the landscape. And he was an early on person about the importance of sustainability, planting trees and dealing with stormwater management and those kinds of issues. So I took a lot of that back to Philadelphia, and I learned much of the same from Mayor Bloomberg in New York, the importance of 311 systems and the ability to connect citizens to their services. And so I announced at the first inauguration, and my staff didn't know I was going to say this. I mean, it's literally written in the margins of my inaugural speech that I was going to make Philadelphia the #1 green city in America.
Yeah.
And they heard it for the first time when I said it from the stage. They're like, what? So, look, it's the first day. We don't even have a plan. But about a year later, we announced Greenworks Philadelphia. And it was our plan to, if not #1, to be a prominent player. And we made Philadelphia prominent in that way. This is an important city as it relates to sustainability. We've got the 4 seasons. I mean, the 4 real seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter. We get, a fair amount of snow and rain and significant weather events. Stormwater management is a very serious issue. We have flooding in a variety of places in our city. But also, Hank, often tied our sustainability efforts to jobs. And so I talked about the need for, alternative energy sources. I talked about wind and solar, and that we could put people to work. I talked about why recycling was so important, at least at the time. And there was a market for our recyclables, unlike now. And so what I try to do with sustainability is to always connect it to the people. That, sometimes these loftier goals, and you talk about, rising sea level and the ozone layer and, icebergs and, breaking away, et cetera, et cetera. I always try to make it relatable, that it was about saving your neighborhood, it was about jobs, it was about economic opportunity. And many of our citizens, I think, really got it and they were enthusiastic about it. And that's where any success came from.
Yeah. And, for a number of years now, the progress that's being made in climate change has been at the city level.
Hmm.
And, I assume you believe that they could play an even bigger role if the cities were bolstered by better state or national policies, right?
There's no question about that. But interestingly enough, and I talk to, as I know you do, I mean, I talk to a lot of mayors across the country. And when Donald Trump announced that the United States was, for instance, was going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, I feel very comfortable in saying that not one mayor in the United States of America paid any attention to that at all. Because if you're a mayor in Florida, you know that climate change is real with rising sea level. If you're out in California with the fires, if you're in the middle of the country with the flooding, if you're up in the Northeast, some of the severe, I mean, Hank, in 2020, we literally ran out of the names that are normally used for hurricanes. I mean, we're now into the Greek alphabet, right? So, it's real, it's serious. And so at the local level, you don't have time for this kind of nonsense. You will not virtually not be able to find a mayor who's a climate denier. They get it. They understand it.
Yeah, they see it. Now I'm going to switch. We've been talking about the US. I'm going to talk about China a little bit
Mm-hmm.
because you've joined me in meetings with Chinese
Yeah.
mayors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think mayors, and you've done this both in the United States
Yeah.
and
And
in
China.
You've
Yeah,
gone
you sent me to China. Yeah.
Yeah, and and the Chinese, as you know, are dealing with urbanization on a massive scale.
Massive.
So,
Yeah.
so whether in China or the U.S., I think mayors, both places are problem solvers,
Yeah.
and they seem to have a natural affinity for one another.
Mm-hmm.
So today, relations between our two countries are
Yeah.
particularly fraught.
Right.
And I think they're going to be that way for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a bit about your experiences with China, what
Yeah.
you've seen with Chinese companies,
Yeah.
Chinese investors, the mayors who are your counterparts, and what advice would you have for the Biden administration as they seek to manage this very important bilateral relationship?
Well, again, I will always appreciate and always thank you in any forum for encouraging me and supporting me to go to China when I was president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors back in 2012, and just an incredible experience. And obviously, 2012 is like almost a lifetime ago, but the memories remain and the experiences. One of the amazing things, I don't know how many Americans know this. I mean, in China, a small city is like 5 million people. you know, so I mean, it's just at a very different scale.
A big city's 30 million, right?
Yeah. We have nothing like that. But I specifically met directly with both the mayors of Tianjin, which is a sister city to Philadelphia, and Beijing. Beijing was the main reason that I went to give that talk back then. I found great relationships and great respect in all the encounters that I've had, whether in the States or the one time in China. I think mayors do understand each other at a level and can even break through if there are, language barriers. Many of the Chinese mayors would say to me, well, my English is not that good. And I would say, but I speak no Chinese. So, you're still in a better situation than I am. But they feel the same pressures. And regardless of, our systems are different in terms of, how you become mayor in either of the countries, but they still have the responsibility. I don't know if it's still the case, but at the time, one of their big metrics was GDP, which fascinated me because that's not a metric generally for an American mayor. And so they were grappling with infrastructure challenges, clean water, clean air, plants, and just the influx of people into their cities and the inability of their infrastructure to handle it. But when you talk about the incoming Biden administration and trying to deal with China, I mean, obviously, there's a global politic, international relations that goes with that. But I would encourage them, because even in China, basically mayors have to get stuff done to serve people. And so if the Biden administration were able, and certainly with your support, convene as many meetings, summits, conferences between and among American mayors and mayors in China, I think that would actually help the national politics of it. I during my time, certainly encouraged Chinese business people to come to Philadelphia and to invest. One of the mayors brought a delegation to Philadelphia with business people. They're looking for investment here, and many American businesses are looking for investment opportunities in China. People still want to do business, and we could be each other's greatest partners. I remind people all the time, my job was to fill potholes and pick up trash. So, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on the international relations component of it and trade deficits, et cetera, et cetera. But I think if you put a bunch of mayors together in a room, they would actually start to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, just to resonate two things you say. When times are the most difficult between Beijing and Washington, building bridges is very important.
Hmm.
And as many bridges as we can have. It's
Yeah,
hard to go to war and fight with people that you know and that are friends.
yeah,
And I think the mayor-to-mayor bridges are particularly important. The
yeah,
other thing, which today, when you go to China, and I haven't been now because of the pandemic for a while, but in addition to reciting GDP, they're all reciting air quality numbers, environmental,
mhm,
targets that are being
yeah,
met.
yeah,
They have a big focus on that.
yeah.
So I want to now get your view on another big issue. In the wake of this pandemic, there's been a lot of speculation as to what the future holds for cities. It
Mhm.
wasn't long ago, when we started with the economic strategy group, that we were talking about people flocking to the cities, and the urban rural divide was a
Yeah,
major concern.
yeah,
Now, many are fleeing the city.
yeah,
Okay. And to what extent will COVID-19 and its economic aftermath impact cities?
yeah,
And how should city leaders be responding?
yeah.
Is this just a short-term phenomena? Is it going to have a longer-term tail? How do you see it?
I'm tending more to the side of a, slightly longer tail. I don't think this is going to be a blip on the screen, but I think that there are ways for us to deal with this. First of all, there is still something, I mean, hopefully no one is out there saying that, cities are dead. We have surprised people numerous times. All of them have certainly taken a hit. People who can, get to the suburbs or get to their other place or, want to be in a bigger house or need room, because of COVID-19. We certainly understand that. Remote work, I think is going to continue to be a thing for some time. I think American businesses, internationally, people are figuring out, maybe we don't have to have everybody in the office. Maybe we don't have to have all this real estate. Maybe, but there is still something to the liveliness of cities that you just can't get in some other places. I think first and foremost, cities like the states and obviously the federal government, we have to get this virus under control. And I think once that happens, you actually will see some people, coming back to cities. We've got to get kids in school safely and adults back to work safely. You really jumpstart the economy. The federal government, we've got to break through this idea of the federal government almost fundamentally starving cities. All the efforts that took place back in the spring, many of which need to be replicated. I mean, the Federal Reserve and Fed chair, so many others calling for increased investment in cities and states. I mean, all of these things go together. And it's not like I'm sitting here saying anything of any brilliance. I think they all know this. This is just bad politics. And we've got to figure out how to break through it. A city like Philadelphia, it's very easy for people to stay in the suburbs and still have business activity in the city. And so I think cities are really going to be forced, if they haven't already, to have better relationships with their regional political jurisdictions and figure out now how to fully function more as a region and not just as a city by itself, and slowly get economic activity back in the cities. But we need to stop competing with our suburbs and embrace them as partners.
To just emphasize one thing you said, it's bad politics and it's terrible economic policy not be providing stimulus money to the cities. So all those that argue, well, we're bailing them out, would be bailing them out of mismanagement. No, that's not the case.
False.
The other programs, the other stimulus have been designed to replace income that was lost because of the pandemic, whether it's
Right.
to small businesses or to individuals. Well,
Right.
guess what?
Right.
Replacing part of the money the cities have lost is essential. And one of the things we learned in 2008 coming out of that crisis
Mhm.
is we would have come out quicker, but state and local governments, particularly cities, had problems. And
Yes.
so there's a big impact to money going to the cities.
Right.
Big impact. And
Absolutely.
it's a shame that it hasn't happened.
And the interesting, one last point on that. And so the federal government stepped up. It started in '08, while, of course, you were still there, and then carried over into the Obama administration. You can always find, a few things here or there, but I mean, there were virtually no issues, no problems, no scandals with the cities and the counties and the states out of the big economic stimulus program from 2008 and 2009. I mean, it's just it's this fiction that and the politics. We're going to bail out these democratic cities that mismanage themselves. I mean, the government literally put people out of work.
Yeah.
In this pandemic, right, to save lives.
Government did. The government did. And if there's ever the right role for government, it's to replace at least part of that revenue.
Yeah.
Now, one last question, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
So, young people today,
Yeah.
What advice would you give to young people who are interested in pursuing a career in public service or local government? And would your advice differ at all for a young Black professional?
The advice would be the same. I give everybody pretty much the same advice. Get engaged, get involved, pay attention to what's going on. There are numerous opportunities to serve, local, state, federal, just in your community. You don't have to start out trying to run for mayor or governor or something. There are school boards, there are general assemblies and state legislatures. There's, get on an advisory board, find your passion, figure out how you can fit in. Meet people, get engaged, get involved. And, if people want change, you have to be a part of the change. It's not like changing the channel on the TV. I mean, you actually have to do something.
That's best advice I've heard in a long time because, so many people want to start at the wrong level. If you're a young person, you can afford almost anything other than not to learn. And you've got to get your hands dirty. You've got to learn your stuff, get involved, do a good job, and one thing will lead to another, right?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. I mean, that's how I came up. That's how I learned. I mean, as I mentioned, I lost that first city council race. I mean, look, I've won and I've lost. I know which one I like better. And I didn't know it at the time. But actually, the best thing that happened to me was to lose that first race. I learned about myself. I learned about other people. But most importantly, I also learned that I really don't like to lose. And I never lost another race after that one.
That's a good lesson. Mike, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot today. I'm really glad that you continue to be so active in the most important issues of today.
Well, having a good time, and I appreciate our friendship and relationship, and you keep me pretty active too.
You have listened to Straight Talk with Hank Paulson, a podcast of the Paulson Institute. To find more episodes from leading thinkers and doers, please visit paulsoninstitute.org/Straight Talk or download on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, and Stitcher. And don't forget to rate and subscribe. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.